The town of Elmsworth had a cemetery so old that even its name had faded from memory. Locals called it the Silent Field, for no birds sang there, no animals roamed, and even the wind seemed to avoid it. The cemetery had been closed for decades, but its gates still stood ajar, as if daring anyone to enter. For years, people whispered stories about the Silent Field, stories of those who ventured in and never came out. Some claimed the cemetery was cursed. Others spoke of strange, shadowy figures seen among the graves at dusk. Most dismissed these tales as folklore, but there was one story everyone agreed was true. Decades ago, a gravedigger named Walter Hensley had been the last caretaker of the cemetery. He was an unremarkable man who lived a solitary life in a small house near the cemetery gates. Walter's routine was mundane. He maintained the grounds, dug graves, and occasionally shooed away trespassers. That is, until the day he vanished. One stormy night, neighbors reported hearing blood-curdling screams coming from the cemetery. When authorities arrived, they found Walter's house abandoned, the door swinging in the wind. His tools were scattered across the cemetery, and a freshly dug grave was left open. In the pit, they found not a coffin, but Walter's hat and a trail of claw marks leading deep into the soil. His body was never recovered. Years later, a group of thrill-seekers decided to investigate the Silent Field, determined to debunk the legends. Among them was Emma, a skeptic with a fascination for the paranormal. She carried a flashlight, a notebook, and a stubborn belief that the stories were nothing more than superstitions. Alongside her were her friends, Jake, who had a talent for bravado, and Lisa, whose apprehension grew with every step they took into the cemetery. The night was oppressively quiet as they passed through the rusted gates. The air was heavy, and the scent of damp earth lingered like a warning. The group wandered among the tombstones, some so old their inscriptions had eroded to nothing. Jake laughed nervously, making jokes to mask his unease, while Lisa clung to Emma's arm. "This place isn't haunted," Emma declared, her voice echoing in the silence. "It's just old and neglected." But as the words left her mouth, they heard a soft scraping sound. It came from ahead, near the cemetery's center. They froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, though his voice wavered. Emma, determined to prove her point, led the way toward the sound. They came upon a gravestone marked with the name Walter Hensley. The stone was cracked, and the earth beneath it looked freshly disturbed. "That's weird," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Before Emma could respond, the scraping sound grew louder. The ground at Walter's grave began to shift, as if something beneath the soil was struggling to emerge. Jake backed away, muttering curses, but Emma stood her ground, flashlight trained on the grave. Suddenly, a hand burst through the dirt, a skeletal, decayed hand that clawed at the air. Emma screamed as the figure of Walter Hensley pulled itself out of the grave, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His jaw hung open in a grotesque grin, and his fingers, now sharpened to points, reached toward them. The friends turned to run, but the cemetery seemed to close in around them. The paths twisted and turned, leading them back to Walter's grave no matter which direction they fled. The air grew colder, and shadows stretched unnaturally, as if alive. Jake was the first to fall. As he ran, a bony hand shot out from the ground, wrapping around his ankle and dragging him into the earth. His screams echoed for only a moment before they were silenced. Emma and Lisa clung to each other, desperate to find an escape. They stumbled upon a crypt and ducked inside, slamming the heavy door behind them. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and their flashlights revealed walls lined with ancient coffins. Outside, they could hear Walter's rasping voice. "You disturbed my rest. Now you'll join me." The door shuddered as something slammed against it. Emma frantically searched the crypt for a weapon, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls. Lisa sobbed, her terror overtaking her. Then the door burst open. Walter stood there, his skeletal form illuminated by the moonlight. Behind him, other figures emerged from the shadows, silent, shambling corpses that had risen from their graves. Their hollow eyes glowed like his, and their movements were slow but deliberate. Emma and Lisa screamed as the dead swarmed the crypt. Emma swung her flashlight, but it was no use. The last thing she saw was Walter's grinning face, his claws reaching for her throat. Days later, authorities found the group's abandoned car near the cemetery gates. Inside the Silent Field, they discovered no trace of Emma, Jake, or Lisa. However, a new grave had appeared in the center of the cemetery, marked with 3 nameless headstones. Locals claimed the cemetery had grown quieter since that night, but those who passed by could sometimes hear whispers carried on the wind, pleas for help that faded as quickly as they came. No one dared enter the silent field again.
Story number 2.
There's a cemetery tucked away in the woods just outside of Pine Hollow, known only as Shade Watch. It's a forgotten place, overrun by time, with cracked headstones and rusted iron gates tangled in vines. The townsfolk rarely spoke of it, and when they did, their voices lowered as if the cemetery itself could hear. The legend goes that Shade Watch was once a burial ground for the unclaimed dead, criminals, outcasts, and those deemed too cursed to rest in consecrated ground. But it wasn't the dead who gave the cemetery its dark reputation. It was the Watcher. No one knew what the Watcher was. Some said it was a man who had once worked as the cemetery's caretaker, cursed to wander the grounds for eternity. Others believed it was something far older, something that fed on the souls of those foolish enough to trespass. Eliza didn't believe in legends. A journalism student with a sharp mind and a thirst for the truth, she decided to investigate the stories about Shadewatch for an expose. The deeper the fear, the better the headlines, she thought. Accompanied by her friend Nate, who reluctantly agreed to document the trip, Eliza set off into the woods one moonless night. The journey to Shadewatch was treacherous. The dense forest seemed alive, the trees groaning and creaking as though warning them to turn back. By the time they reached the gates, Nate was visibly shaken. Eliza, however, pushed forward with her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. "Just an old cemetery," she muttered. Nothing scary about that. But the moment they stepped through the gates, the air shifted. It felt heavier, suffocating. There were no sounds, not even the chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves. The silence pressed against their ears like cotton, making every breath seem too loud. The graves were scattered haphazardly, many of them sunken or broken. Nate whispered, "This place feels wrong. Let's just take a few pictures and go." Eliza ignored him, focusing her camera on the eerie scenery. She moved deeper into the cemetery, past rows of nameless graves, until she spotted something unusual. In the center of the graveyard stood a tall, black obelisk, untouched by time. Its surface shimmered as though it were wet, and strange runes were carved into its base. As she approached, a cold gust of wind rushed past, extinguishing her flashlight. "Damn it!" she hissed, fumbling to turn it back on. That's when Nate screamed. Eliza spun around, her flashlight flickering to life. Nate was on the ground, clawing at something unseen. His eyes were wide with terror as he gasped, "It's here! It's here!" Before Eliza could react, he was dragged backward by an invisible force, his nails scraping deep gouges in the dirt. She lunged for him, grabbing his arm, but it was like pulling against a hurricane. Nate was yanked into the shadows, his screams fading as though swallowed by the darkness. Eliza stood frozen, her breath ragged. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path behind her. She turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. At first, she saw nothing. Then a figure emerged from the shadows near the obelisk. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs and a face shrouded in darkness. Its head tilted unnaturally as it regarded her, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with a cold, white light. The Watcher. Eliza's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure raised one long arm, pointing at her. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, and she felt herself sinking into the soil. It was as if the cemetery itself was swallowing her whole. Desperate, she clawed at the dirt, her flashlight forgotten. The Watcher stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid, as if it were gliding rather than walking. Its voice, a low, guttural rasp, filled her mind. "Stay. Forever." The last thing Eliza saw before the earth closed over her was the Watcher's face, or what she thought was a face, stretching into a ghastly grin. The next morning, hikers found Eliza's car abandoned at the edge of the woods. Her camera was discovered near the gates of Shadewatch, but the memory card was empty. No trace of Eliza or Nate was ever found. Locals say the Watcher claims one or two souls every few years, always those who dare to challenge its domain. And if you stand at the edge of the forest on a quiet night, you might hear a faint whisper carried on the wind. Stay. Forever.
Story number 3.
The road leading to Blackthorn Cemetery was seldom used. A forgotten stretch of cracked asphalt winding through miles of desolate countryside. The cemetery itself was hidden behind a crumbling stone wall, shrouded in mist that never seemed to lift. The only way in was through a heavy iron gate that groaned like a dying animal whenever it moved. No one visited Blackthorn anymore. Those who had family buried there either moved away or simply stopped coming. Some said it was because of the isolation. Others whispered about something much darker. They said Blackthorn wasn't a place for the dead to rest. It was a trap. Evan didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or the supernatural. A practical man, he inherited his grandfather's old house near Blackthorn and saw an opportunity. The cemetery was still technically family property, and Evan figured he could clean it up, turn it into a historical site, and make some money from curious tourists. One rainy afternoon, armed with a shovel and a thermos of coffee, Evan set out to begin clearing the cemetery. The gate resisted his efforts, groaning loudly as he pushed it open. The air beyond was colder, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach turn. The graves were in worse condition than he'd expected. Many of the headstones were toppled, the inscriptions worn away. Some graves had been disturbed, the earth sunken or scattered as if something had clawed its way out. Animals, he muttered, shaking off a shiver. As he worked, pulling weeds and removing debris, he noticed something strange. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds of life at all, just the steady rhythm of his shovel against the damp soil. By sunset, he had cleared a small section of the cemetery and was packing up his tools when he noticed a crypt at the far end of the grounds. It was a squat, ominous structure, its stone door sealed with a rusted chain. Something about it made his skin crawl, but curiosity got the better of him. Evan approached the crypt, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The closer he got, the stronger the metallic scent became, like rust or dried blood. He reached out to touch the chain, and the moment his fingers made contact, the air grew impossibly cold. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound from inside the crypt. He stepped back, heart pounding. Probably just rats, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it became a frantic pounding. Evan stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, the pounding stopped. Silence. Evan laughed nervously, brushing dirt off his pants. "Get a grip," he muttered. But as he turned to leave, he heard a voice, faint, almost a whisper, coming from the crypt. "Help me." The words froze him in place. It was a woman's voice, pleading, desperate. He turned back to the crypt, his rational mind at war with his instincts. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. "Please, help me." Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Evan grabbed his shovel and smashed the chain. The rusted links gave way, clattering to the ground. He pushed open the heavy stone door, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the crypt was dark, the air thick and oppressive. His flashlight beam illuminated a single stone coffin at the center, its lid slightly ajar. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please, I'm trapped." Evan approached the coffin, his hands trembling. He placed his shovel under the lid and pried it open. The lid slid off, crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. Inside was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were tattered and her hands were raw, the nails broken and bloodied. How are you alive?" Evan stammered, reaching to help her out. The woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength, pulling herself upright. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he thought he saw gratitude. But then her lips curled into a smile, too wide, too sharp. "I've waited so long," she said, her voice no longer pleading, but filled with something ancient and cruel. Evan tried to pull away, but her grip was iron. Her body twisted unnaturally as she climbed out of the coffin, her limbs contorting at impossible angles. Her smile grew wider, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. "Thank you," she hissed. "Now you'll take my place." The last thing Evan saw was her face splitting open, darkness spilling out and consuming him whole. When the townspeople noticed activity at Blackthorn, they assumed Evan had begun his renovations. But when they ventured to the cemetery weeks later, they found it eerily unchanged. Except for one thing. The crypt door stood open, the chain discarded on the ground. Inside they found a single coffin, its lid sealed tight. And etched into the stone, fresh and deep, was Evan's name. Locals say that if you listen closely near the crypt at night, you can hear scratching. And if you're foolish enough to investigate, you might hear a voice pleading for help. But no one who enters Blackthorn ever comes out again.
Story number 4.
In the heart of Calico Valley lay a small cemetery called Hollow Ridge, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient oaks. Unlike most cemeteries, it had no flowers, no markers of love and remembrance. The graves were crude and unkempt, with crooked headstones and sunken earth, as though the dead were restless. Locals avoided Hollow Ridge, especially after dark, They spoke in hushed tones about the legend of the grave dancer, a specter that appeared when the moon was full. According to the stories, the dancer would glide silently among the graves, her movements hypnotic, her presence both beautiful and horrifying. It was said that if you watched her for too long, she would see you too, and you'd never escape. Ella didn't believe in ghosts. A city girl who had moved to Calico Valley for her job, she dismissed the local tales as superstitious nonsense. When she overheard her coworkers talking about the grave dancer, she laughed and decided to prove them wrong. The night of the full moon, Ella grabbed a flashlight and a camera and made her way to Hollow Ridge. The air was cold and still, and the forest was unnaturally quiet. The gate to the cemetery stood open, its iron bars twisted as if melted. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, stepping inside. The cemetery was darker than she expected, the moonlight barely piercing the dense canopy above. Her flashlight beam danced over the graves, revealing tangled weeds and moss-covered stones. She took a few photos, more out of boredom than fear. Then she heard it, a faint humming, soft and melodic. Ella froze, her heart pounding. She scanned the cemetery with her flashlight, but the light caught only shadows. The humming grew louder, turning into a haunting tune that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then she saw her. At the far end of the cemetery, a figure in a flowing white dress moved gracefully among the graves. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her movements were entrancing, as if she were performing a solemn waltz. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground, and her dress billowed around her as though caught in an invisible breeze. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should leave, but something about the dancer's movements held her captive. She raised her camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the figure for a brief second, and Ella thought she saw the veil flutter, revealing a glimpse of the dancer's face. It was hideous, eyes black as coal, skin rotted and peeling, and a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The humming stopped. Ella's blood ran cold as the dancer's head snapped toward her, the veil settling back into place. The specter began to move, gliding closer, her movements no longer graceful but jagged and unnatural. Panic surged through Ella as she stumbled backward, dropping her camera. She turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly, the path twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps. Not the soft glide of the dancer, but heavy, deliberate steps, as though someone or something was following her. "Please, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She burst through the cemetery gates and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The footsteps stopped. When she looked back, the cemetery was silent, the graves bathed in cold moonlight. Ella staggered to her feet and ran home, locking every door and window. She tried to convince herself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light. But when she retrieved her camera the next day, the photos told a different story. The images showed the dancer in horrifying detail, her veil lifted, her decayed face staring directly into the lens. In the final photo, she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure loomed behind Ella, its skeletal hand reaching for her shoulder. Ella left Calico Valley the next day, but the dancer wasn't finished with her. Every full moon, she would wake to the sound of humming, soft and melodic, coming from just outside her window. And no matter where she went, she always found muddy footprints on her floor the next morning, prints that led straight to her bed.
Story number 5.
There was a tree in Willow Grove Cemetery that no one dared approach, even during the day. The black oak stood at the cemetery's center, its gnarled branches stretching unnaturally wide, as if trying to ensnare the graves around it. The tree was ancient, older than the town itself, and its bark was blackened as though it had been struck by lightning 1,000 times. But it wasn't the tree's appearance that frightened people. It was the whispers. Anyone who lingered near the black oak swore they could hear faint voices, murmuring secrets too horrible to comprehend. Some claimed the whispers came from the roots, as if the tree had devoured the souls of the dead and was now speaking their tormented thoughts. Others believed the tree was alive, a sinister entity that lured people close only to consume them. Clara had heard the stories her whole life. Growing up in Willow Grove, she'd always been fascinated by the tales of the black oak, even as they terrified her. When her grandmother passed away and was buried in the cemetery, Clara decided to face her fears. Her grandmother's grave was close to the tree, and she refused to let some silly legend keep her from visiting. On a chilly autumn evening, Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara walked into the cemetery with a bouquet of chrysanthemums. The air was cool and damp, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. She found her grandmother's grave easily, marked with a simple stone etched with loving words. Clara knelt and placed the flowers, murmuring a prayer. As she stood to leave, a strange sound caught her attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill up her spine. Whispering. Clara turned toward the black oak, her breath hitching. The tree loomed in the twilight, its twisted branches swaying slightly in a breeze she couldn't feel. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of disjointed voices overlapping, their words indistinct but filled with urgency. "It's just the wind," she told herself, though the explanation felt hollow. She stepped closer to the tree, drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear. The ground beneath the oak was bare, the grass refusing to grow near its roots. As Clara approached, the whispers sharpened, becoming clearer. "Help us!" Clara froze. The voices were pleading, filled with desperation. She looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, but the cemetery was empty. "Please, dig." Her heart pounded as she noticed something odd. The ground near the tree's base was uneven, as if freshly disturbed. Against every instinct telling her to run, Clara retrieved a small gardening trowel from her bag. She knelt and began to dig. The soil was loose, almost as if the tree wanted her to uncover whatever lay beneath. After a few minutes, her trowel hit something solid. She brushed away the dirt, revealing a small wooden box, its surface cracked and weathered. Clara hesitated, but the whispers grew louder, urging her on. With trembling hands, she opened the box. Inside was a collection of yellowed photographs, their edges curling with age. Each photo depicted a person standing near the black oak, their expressions blank, their eyes hollow. Beneath the photos was a piece of paper, brittle and covered in spidery handwriting. Clara squinted to read the words. "Do not disturb the roots. They are hungry." The ground beneath her shifted. Clara gasped as she felt something wrap around her ankle. Looking down, she saw a thin, black root coiling around her leg, its texture slick and cold. She tried to pull away, but the root tightened, dragging her closer to the tree. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel and mocking. More roots emerged, slithering like snakes, wrapping around her arms and waist. Clara screamed, clawing at the ground, but the tree's grip was relentless. As she was pulled toward the base of the oak, she saw faces in the bark. Twisted, agonized faces that seemed to shift and writhe. They were the people from the photographs, their mouths open in silent screams. The last thing Clara heard before she was dragged beneath the soil was a single chilling word: more. The next day, Clara's car was found parked outside the cemetery, but she was never seen again. Her disappearance became yet another story tied to the black oak, a warning to those who dared venture too close. Locals say the tree has grown since that night, its branches spreading wider, its whispers louder, and if you stand near it long enough, you might hear Clara's voice among the others, begging for someone to dig her out. But no one ever does. This story blends the eerie atmosphere of an ancient curse with the terror of being consumed by something malevolent and inescapable, perfect for a truly unsettling experience.
Story number 6.
In a small town nestled in the hills, there was a cemetery known as St. Mercy's. It was old, its tombstones weathered and leaning, the iron fence surrounding it rusted and jagged. But St. Mercy's wasn't known for its age or its graves. It was known for her, the Midnight Mourner. Every night at exactly midnight, a woman in a long black veil would appear among the graves. She would walk slowly, her gloved hands clutching a single red rose. She never spoke, never looked up, and never stopped until she reached the same grave, a crumbling, unmarked stone near the cemetery's center. Those who dared to watch her said she would kneel by the grave, placing the rose on the dirt. Then she would begin to cry. Her sobs were soft at first, but would grow louder, more anguished, until they echoed through the cemetery like the wails of the damned. No one knew who she was or why she mourned. Some said she was the ghost of a grieving widow, forever bound to the grave of her lost love. Others believed she was something far darker, a demon luring the curious to their doom. Ethan, a skeptic and thrill-seeker, had heard the stories all his life. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and he was determined to prove the Midnight Mourner was nothing more than a local legend. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he decided to visit St. Mercy's at midnight. The night was cold and still as Ethan entered the cemetery, the gate creaking loudly behind him. The moon cast an eerie glow over the graves, and a faint mist clung to the ground. He checked his watch. 11:59 p.m. Ethan waited, his breath visible in the chilly air. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature plummeted, and the cemetery grew unnervingly silent. Then he saw her. She emerged from the shadows like a figure from a dream, or a nightmare. Her black dress billowed as she moved, and her veil obscured her face. She clutched the rose tightly, her steps deliberate and slow. Ethan's heart raced as he raised his phone, filming her every movement. "Gotcha," he whispered. The mourner reached the unmarked grave and knelt, placing the rose gently on the earth. Then, as if on cue, she began to cry. The sound was haunting, filled with sorrow so profound it made Ethan's chest tighten. He almost felt guilty for intruding, but his curiosity pushed him forward. "Hey," he called out, stepping closer. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The mourner's sobs stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. He took another step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I just want to talk." Slowly, the mourner stood. She didn't turn to face him, but Ethan felt the weight of her attention, as if her unseen eyes were boring into him. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was hollow, barely a whisper, but it echoed in Ethan's ears like a scream. Before he could respond, she turned. The veil lifted slightly, revealing her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was pale and shriveled, her eyes sunken and black. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Ethan stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam flickered wildly as the mourner began to move toward him, her steps no longer slow but jerky and unnatural, as though something was forcing her to walk. "Stay with me," she rasped, her voice layered with the cries of countless others. Ethan turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't look back, not even when he heard her footsteps quickening behind him, or when her laughter, low and guttural, filled the air. He burst through the cemetery gate and didn't stop running until he reached his car. Slamming the door shut, he glanced back at St. Mercy's. She was standing just inside the gate, her veil once again concealing her face. Slowly, she raised her hand and waved. Ethan never returned to St. Mercy's. He tried to forget what he'd seen, but the midnight mourner wouldn't let him. Every night at midnight, he heard her cries, no matter where he was. Sometimes, he caught glimpses of her in reflections, standing in the corner of his room watching him from the window. And every morning, without fail, he found a single red rose lying on his pillow.
Story number 7.
Maplewood Cemetery was ordinary at first glance, a small resting place nestled at the edge of the woods. The graves were neat, the paths well-maintained, and the air carried the familiar scent of damp earth and pine. But one grave at the far end of the cemetery had no headstone, no flowers, and no name. Just a rectangular patch of dirt that remained freshly turned as though waiting for someone. It had been there for decades, untouched by grass or time, its edges unnaturally crisp. The locals whispered that the grave was cursed, that anyone who lingered near it too long would vanish. Some said it was a portal to the underworld. Others claimed it belonged to someone who had cheated death, and death was still waiting. Amelia, a writer researching local legends, was drawn to the empty grave like a moth to a flame. She didn't believe in curses or supernatural nonsense, but the mystery intrigued her. Armed with her notebook and camera, she arrived at Maplewood just before sunset. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the occasional caw of a crow. Amelia followed the winding path to the grave, her boots crunching on the gravel. When she reached the plot, she was struck by how out of place it seemed. The rest of the cemetery felt peaceful, but this grave exuded an eerie wrongness. The air around it was colder, and the faint scent of decay lingered, though there was no body to rot. Amelia knelt by the edge, running her fingers through the soil. It was loose and damp, as if freshly dug, though she knew it hadn't been touched in years. She began taking photos, capturing the unnatural sharpness of the grave's edges, the way the shadows seemed to gather around it. As she reviewed the images, a chill ran down her spine. In every photo, there was something wrong. A faint figure, almost imperceptible, stood at the edge of the grave, watching her. Its outline was blurry, but its eyes, two black voids, were unmistakable. Amelia's breath hitched. She looked around, her pulse quickening, but the cemetery was empty. The sun was sinking below the horizon, and long shadows stretched across the graves. "It's just a trick of the light," she muttered, though her voice trembled. She decided to leave, but as she stood, she felt it, a pull, gentle but undeniable, coming from the grave. Her legs refused to move, her body frozen as if anchored in place. Then she heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, rising from the earth. "Stay with me." Amelia stumbled backward, finally breaking free. The grave shifted before her eyes, the soil churning like something was moving beneath it. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "It's waiting for you." The ground buckled, and Amelia fell, her hands sinking into the dirt. She felt something cold and wet wrap around her wrist, like fingers, but impossibly long and strong. She screamed, yanking her arm free, and scrambled to her feet. The grave was no longer empty. A figure stood in its center, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a guttural growl that echoed through the cemetery. Amelia ran, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached her car. The image of the figure burned into her mind. She tried to forget Maplewood, but the grave wouldn't let her. Every night she dreamed of the figure pulling her into the earth, its cold fingers wrapping around her throat, and every morning she found soil on her bedroom floor, a trail of dirt leading from her bed to her door. One night, the voice returned, not in her dreams, but in her room. "It's time," it whispered, so close she could feel the cold breath on her neck. The next morning, Amelia's neighbors noticed her car was still in the driveway, her lights still on. When they entered her home, they found her room empty, but in the center of her bed was a pile of fresh soil. And when they checked Maplewood Cemetery, the empty grave was no longer empty.
Story number 8.
In the dense, fog-laden woods of Black Hollow, people whispered about the Lantern Man. He was a figure of shadow and flame, a spirit who roamed the forest with a flickering lantern in hand. Those who saw the light were never the same again, if they returned at all. It was said the Lantern Man appeared to the lost and the desperate, offering guidance with his gentle glow. But his help came at a price. Once you followed his light, you could never leave the forest. Leela didn't believe in legends. She was a hiker, confident and experienced, who loved exploring the untamed wilderness. Black Hollow's reputation as haunted only intrigued her further, and she decided to spend a weekend camping there alone, eager to prove there was nothing to fear. The first day passed uneventfully. She set up her tent near a small clearing and spent hours wandering the trails, marveling at the forest's beauty. The fog was thicker than she expected, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers, but it only added to the charm. As night fell, the forest became unnervingly quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against her ears. Around midnight, Lila woke suddenly, her breath visible in the icy air. She wasn't sure what had disturbed her until she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance, just beyond the tree line. Her first thought was that it was another camper, maybe someone who needed help. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the foggy woods, following the light. The lantern's glow was warm and inviting, bobbing gently as if carried by an unseen hand. "Hello?" Lila called out. Her voice seemed to vanish into the mist. The light paused for a moment, then moved deeper into the woods. Lila hesitated. Something about the silence felt wrong, but curiosity pushed her forward. She followed the light, her boots crunching softly on the damp ground. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the trees and turning the world into a featureless haze. After what felt like hours, the light stopped. Lila stepped closer, her heart pounding as the figure holding the lantern came into view. He was tall and thin, his silhouette barely visible against the glow. His face was obscured by shadow, but his eyes burned like embers. The lantern swung gently in his hand, its flame unnaturally steady despite the mist. "You're lost," the Lantern Man said, his voice low and melodic. "I'm not lost," Lila replied, though her confidence wavered. She realized she couldn't remember the way back to her camp. The Lantern Man tilted his head as if amused. "Everyone who finds me is lost. Come, I'll show you the way." He turned and began walking, the lantern casting eerie shadows on the fog. Lila followed, unsure why she trusted him, but unable to stop herself. The path twisted and turned, leading deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The fog thickened, wrapping around Lila like a shroud. After a while, she noticed something strange. The lantern's flame wasn't lighting the way. It was consuming the darkness, swallowing it whole. She glanced at the Lantern Man, and for the first time she saw his face. It was hollow, a skull covered in charred flesh, his burning eyes set deep in empty sockets. His grin was wide and unnatural, his teeth sharp as knives. "Wait," she stammered, stepping back. I want to go back. The lantern man stopped and turned to her. There's no going back, he said, his grin widening. The forest is mine now, and so are you. The ground beneath Lila shifted, turning soft and spongy. She looked down and saw the earth writhing, blackened roots coiling like snakes around her feet. No, she screamed, struggling against the roots, but they held her tight. The lantern man stepped closer, raising the lantern high. Its flame flared, blindingly bright, and Lila felt her body grow weightless. The last thing she saw was his skeletal grin, the flames consuming her vision. When search parties arrived at Black Hollow days later, they found Lila's camp untouched, her belongings neatly arranged. But there was no sign of her, only a single lantern hanging from a tree, its flame flickering softly in the fog. And on quiet nights, hikers still report seeing the lantern man, his glow dancing through the mist, leading the lost deeper into the forest, where they're never seen again.